A good data scientist can build strong models. They can, do really good coding. They can really articulate problems from a technical perspective and be efficient and optimize, the processes from a compute and everything perspective. A great data scientist, and one that is much rarer to find, is one who can go talk to a business partner and explain it to them in such a simple way that the business partner walks away understanding what the solution is.
Welcome to How AI Happens, a podcast where experts explain their work at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence. You'll hear from AI researchers, data scientists, and machine learning engineers as they get technical about the most exciting developments in their field and the challenges they're facing along the way. I'm your host, Rob Stevenson, and we're about to learn how AI happens. Okay, hello again, all of you wonderful artificial intelligence professionals out there in podcast land. It's me, Rob, here with another classic installment of what I hope is your favorite technical AI podcast, and I have a great guest for you. He has had roles in data science and research at loads of different organizations. Currently, he is the head of AI over at Carrier, Seth Walker. Seth, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Rob. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, me as well. And you shared with me that Seth is the Egyptian god of chaos a moment ago, which I did not know that. Maybe not the best approach for AI, right? It's like a little bit of chaos and maybe build in some attention mechanisms to make sure things don't get too off the rails. How do you weave chaos into your role?
Yeah, absolutely. I always joke about that because I feel like, throughout the course of my career, a lot of the AI teams that I've worked on, they've been, very small affairs, right? I mean, AI has historically been something that's a little more experimental and speculative that companies are looking to invest in, but sometimes that level of investment can be a little bit tepid. And as we know, throughout, the last couple of decades, maybe slightly less than that, since AI has really taken off, there have been some significant ups and downs. Companies have invested significant amount of funds into the creation of AI teams and AI solutions that frequently did not necessarily pan out. So I always joke about being kind of chaotic in my approach, only because as a small team you kind of have to be scrappy, especially when it comes to data science solutions, because data science solutions often require you to be very creative in your approach. They require you to wear a lot of different hats, because a lot of times the best solutions are solutions that integrate into in systems and in products that you may not have the skill sets on your team to be able to enable those types of integrations. And so you really have to kind of be all over the place in some ways in terms of being able to agilely move from one and pivot, from one thing to the next. And you never know when your models are going to fail. So you always have to pivot. I joke that when I say that we are agile, we mean it in the truest sense of the word. A lot of teams, they approach agile, and I'm pinning this word, but I say they're rigile, meaning that they use agile tools to such an extent that they become the opposite of agile, right? Like they use the tools as almost it becomes more waterfall in nature, right? And so, we try to be truly agile on our team.
They're agile as long as the agility requires them to use a very specific set of tools and approaches.
Right.
So you were on stage at AWS reInvent, and you spoke a little bit about how the CEO over there kind of gave a mandate to establish a center of excellence in the AI side of house. I want to get to that. Could we first maybe hear a little bit about the company for those who maybe aren't familiar with Carrier or the specific kinds of work you're doing over there? I would love to know a little bit more about it and then how you wound up there too.
Yeah, absolutely. So Carrier is largely, I think people think of it as an HVAC company. So the founder, Willis Carrier, over 100 years ago, invented the modern air conditioning system, like the technology behind modern air conditioning, which, in many ways is probably one of the most disruptive technologies that has ever been created. And in fact, we would not be speaking here today if it weren't for air conditioning, because the amount of heat that, data centers and GPUs and things produce is not practical, right? The systems have to be cooled, and they have to be cooled efficiently in order for the actual hardware to be able to properly function, right? So, in many ways, Carrier is kind of the necessary condition in order for AI to exist from the get-go. But, recent years, Carrier has gone through a lot of transformations, being part of a larger company and then being spun off into a more narrow company that was focused on not just HVAC, but also refrigeration and fire and security. And you may have heard recently that we are engaging in a divestiture of our fire and security business and part of our refrigeration business. And at the same time acquiring a new European HVAC business, and that's called Viessmann, where they have a really large footprint in the residential European market that is focused on heat pump technology, which is more eco-friendly, electric powered, and uses a new type of technology for the movement of heat and efficiency of heating homes, right? I always joke that, our kind of what we do is just we move air, right? We move heat. It's just the laws of thermodynamics. But AI can be applied in so many different ways here at Carrier, and I can talk about those. And real quick, do you want me to get into that, or would you rather me go to the background first?
Yeah, let's get to know Seth. What's the Seth of it all?
Okay. So, my background actually is very, I think, interesting and not typical for a lot of folks that go into AI and data science. I think when you hear a lot of AI professionals, you hear, their engineering background, they have a computer science background, physics. I've seen a lot of physicists that get into the AI space. And those are certainly like really great backgrounds to have in order to be able to be successful in creating AI models. But I come from a more social science background. Now, for those of you that don't know, I know they call things like physics and biology and chemistry, the physical sciences, the hard sciences. But I jokingly say that, at least physics has largely defined laws, right? If I, throw a ball, we can calculate the trajectory of that ball. Now, tell me a model that helps to, easily define the behavior of people, and then we can talk about complexity, right? So in many ways, the social sciences are the hard science in terms of the level of complexity of the kinds of phenomena that you're trying to model. But another thing that people don't know is that when you get into the graduate level of the social sciences, it becomes very, very practical, statistical, machine learning kind of methods, right? Because, at this point in the stage that we are at as a civilization in terms of scientific method and everything, we want numbers to be able to back up any of the claims that we're making, right? We're in the world of, falsification and statistical analysis and everything. And so even in the social sciences, whether it's through surveys or through other types of experiments and everything, or whether we're using observational data, a ton of machine learning and stuff goes on in the background. You cannot be successful in a graduate program in the social sciences without it. And so I think in many ways, it has actually made me a better data scientist, because a lot of the things that, I've historically in my career looked at are like productivity enhancements and things like that, which are fundamentally, human behaviors, right? They're trying to understand the way that humans, their behaviors and how they react to things and how we can predict what they're going to do. And so it lends very nicely into a lot of the applications that we have from a productivity and kind of operation standpoint. But after I, left grad school, I went to the healthcare segment where I worked for many years, very complicated area in the industry. And then after, about 5 or 6 years in the healthcare space, moved to Carrier, very much, a believer in the ESG goals that Carrier has and trying to, do better for our planet. And yeah, it's been quite the run ever since.
It is such a unique background. It's so common to have engineering at minimum. Lots of physicists, I've noticed that as well. Definitely, like you say, STEM, hard sciences. But it's good to know that there's other paths to this space. And it's an exciting time to be in the space. So I do love hearing about that, because there's maybe not the well-trod path through this function like there are in other departments in the business, right? And in sales, for example, where there's sort of a path laid before you. But yeah, it's exciting. I do love to hear that there are all these different ways to the function. But you have primarily served in kind of data science roles prior to this, and I feel like for a while now, every company has hired a couple of data scientists because just because it's like a sexy thing to add, and you got to have a data scientist. Now, having people with the relevant titles on board, very different than establishing a focused center of excellence to unlock the business value of AI, to quote your CEO, right? And so I fear that people out there listening, they may be in that situation where they are a very highly skilled ML engineer, data scientist, and maybe their company isn't really actioned to take full advantage of what they can accomplish with the tech. So I would love to hear a little bit about how you went about that mandate, about how do we unlock the power of AI? How do we get the right people in place? And how do we build an organization that can actually put this stuff to work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I joke earlier about the process part, about being chaotic, right? And about how, you have to be super scrappy as an organization. But at the same time, I've learned a lot of lessons along the way about the importance of process and everything. And so that's really what it comes down to. Because frankly, you've seen a lot of companies make these investments into AI, and there have been some pretty big failures, right? Or some, at least not realizing the value that, no return on investment in these initiatives. And so what I found, right, is that really building the AI models and stuff like that, that's not the hard part, right? I mean, it's actually relatively easy. You get some data, you engineer some features, and look at the leaderboards or use any sort of AutoML solution, and you'll find that a lot of these modeling architectures can produce some pretty good results. What's hard about generating value with AI is doing it in a way that is actually actionable for a specific business problem. And I found that there's about 80% of the time, there's two ways in which, projects fail. You always hear the kind of talking point that 80% of models fail to ever make it into production. During my time at Humana, we managed to flip that, and it was about 80% of our models did make it into a production setting. But we did it because of good process and through focusing on the right kinds of problems, right? Less on what kind of model should we use and that kind of thing. More so on, is this a real business problem that can be solved by AI? Do we have the kind of business stakeholder investment or the buy-in that we need in order to successfully push it from end to end? Meaning that they're also fully aware of the risks that we could potentially go in and try to build a model and it not work. Are they aware of the lift that is required from an operationalization perspective, meaning that we need to actually integrate whatever solution we're building into some sort of workflow, right? That means integrating into an end tool or integrating into a process. I always say when people ask me, what is data science, right? You get lots of different answers. But one that I really like that actually was penned, and I'm not going to steal credit for it, by one of my favorite data scientists I've ever worked with back at Humana. He said, data science is just the act of using machine learning or using data to solve problems or to optimize decision making. And that's really what we're doing, right? And so when you think about how to solve business problems with AI, you're thinking about where in the business are we making decisions that influence the outcomes we want to influence, and how can we connect those specific decisions to specific AI capabilities that we can use to help optimize it, whether that's optimization through making better and more accurate decisions, or whether it's optimization through the lens of we have too many decisions than we can possibly make, and we need the AI model to help us prioritize or optimize what we're doing it on, right? And many in between, right? That's a very simplified version of it. But then on top of that, like your data, are you getting access to the right data? Do you have the right kind of data? Does it represent, does your training data represent accurately your production data? All these types of things. And so when I'm thinking about, how do we create success around AI, it's actually less about, can we build the models? It's, we have lots of people that can build models, right? I mean, we have really strong talent. But it's about setting up those processes so that when we're thinking about the end-to-end model lifecycle, we know from the get-go that we're pretty sure that we're going to have success, that we have a very clear vision and a very clear articulation of what our end goal is and how it's going to fit into the business process or into a product or wherever it's going to sit. And we have a very clear articulation and vision for how we're going to actually go through the process of, solutioning on the use case, working with our business partners all the way through the build and production of the model. So that's kind of one piece, right? But it's like, how do you take that, but then scale it to an entire organization, right? That works great for a single team. But how do I've been in this world where I was in the embedded team, I was in a specific business segment and we were very successful. But then I look at the centralized teams who would very much struggle sometimes with being able to kind of create the value that they need. And, it's hard, right? I mean, even if you have a ton of expertise, it's hard to kind of take those learnings and apply them. And so what we've created here at Carrier is kind of a 5-pillar strategy. Number one pillar is always going to be your data. You always have to make sure that you're providing people with, access and easy access to the data that they need. But more importantly, as we start to kind of socialize and democratize AI, we need that data to be in a format that reduces the risk of having problems with your model. Meaning that, things like leakage, like the common kinds of problems that you see that results in model failures. The other pillars are having a centralized AI platform and giving people the tool set and the technology stack that they need in order to actually build and operationalize the model and perform the deployments and monitoring that needs to be done. Having strong governance around it that's kind of tied into that platform to ensure that we're minimizing the risk to the business, because sometimes it can be hard to really think about the way in which your model can introduce risk to the organization. And then really two other people, which is just people. So number one, like how do we enable individuals throughout the company that are outside of our team and enable them to be able to have the learnings and educate them about AI and educate them about the tooling and educate them about the risks. And then finally, our core delivery team, which is our core folks that are building kind of the initial use cases. How do we, foster their talent and foster their capabilities and give them the kind of pathway they need to be successful?
This framework is, I fear, a little different than the standard skill set, an ML engineer or data scientist might have. And yet it's so important for them to be able to do their jobs and to feel like they're contributing at a high level to their company, right? That their insights they're generating are being acted upon. How much responsibility lies with the individual contributor here to do some of this work to make sure that they're being heard and there is buy-in and they have all this connection to the right business stakeholders and all the stuff you just mentioned?
Yeah. So, I think a big part of this comes down to, I think there's a tendency, especially among some like super technical folks, to focus a little bit too much on the technical component of the solution, right? But, we're in a business, and even if we weren't in a business, whether you're in a nonprofit or just, whatever it is you're doing, you still are trying to solve problems. And those problems ultimately, in many cases, involve, people that need to action on whatever the solution is that you're needing to build. And in my experience, as long as you're creating good solutions and you're able to properly articulate those solutions to, the stakeholders, the rest will follow in many ways. But this is why I always say, like, when I'm scrappy, when I say that, a lot of it is just the ability to kind of really dive in and understand things from the business perspective. Because without that business perspective and without understanding what their processes are and what their problems are and how they use the information and how they actually work on a day-to-day basis, we almost always do kind of a day in the life exercise whenever we're trying to come up with a new, solve a new problem, is that, being able to understand what that is going to make you more successful. And so you can't, especially if you're on a smaller team, the job of an individual contributor, if you want to be truly successful, is that you have to go out there and you have to really think like a person that's in the business. You have to really think about what their needs are, and then you have to be able to accurately communicate that. I always talk about, people will sometimes say, like, what separates like a really amazing or a great data scientist from a good data scientist. Like a good data scientist can build strong models. They can, do really good coding. They can really articulate problems from a technical perspective and be efficient and optimize, the processes from a compute and everything perspective. A great data scientist, and one that is much rarer to find, is one who can go talk to a business partner and explain it to them in such a simple way that the business partner walks away understanding what the solution is, right? And they think about the things that they're building not as just some sort of abstract, kind of technological solution, but an actual process that will be deployed within the business in order to, effectuate an actual solution or effectuate value. So that's the role that an individual contributor plays. Now, from my perspective of, from a leadership position and from thinking about, a COE, I want to be able to abstract that away. Not everyone's going to have those talents. I don't necessarily want everyone to have those talents. So we do want to think about how can we organize and structure our COE such that we can kind of take the people that, have these skill sets, maybe what you might traditionally think of as a product owner or something like that, or now I hear the word like AI translator, things like that, who can kind of make the connection to the business problem and understands the AI solutions just enough to be able to kind of bridge that gap between the business and the tech teams, and then be able to accurately and also effectively communicate with the technical folks so that we can gather the appropriate requirements and everything. So it really just depends on where you're at as an organization in terms of scale and in terms of the kinds of resources and things that you're able to take on. But again, the key is no matter what, regardless of what skills you have or what kinds of roles you have, is that you just have to be able to make that connection. You have to understand exactly how your solution fits into the business. In order to do that, you have to understand the business.
Okay, yeah, that is helpful. And once you have that in place, once you understand the needs of the business, let's assume you're successful with the how here. How do you then measure success? How do you know it's working?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think that there are a couple of different ways, like in terms of as you mature along your kind of journey, right? As you mature as an organization. The first level of success that you're always going to see is like just how many models did we put in production, right? That's always the first one, because putting models in production is hard. Even literally not even thinking about is it being integrated into some sort of, solution or process, but literally just getting the model to run on a regular basis and output scores and be able to, effectively monitor that. is, a very difficult thing to achieve, shockingly difficult sometimes, depending on the tooling that you have available, especially if you're working on-prem. I've been there. Very sorry if you are having to try to operationalize models on-prem. But the second level, right, would be when we start to understand, like, okay, so of all the models that we tried to build, how many not only ended up in production, but how many of them actually ended up integrated into a business process. So it's actually being used. So you're starting to get from the level of, okay, we're building models and they're working, but now we know that the business is using it. And that's, another one. But the top level of maturity is when you're actually able to start to measure the impact that your models are having. So this is really hard, right? It's a hard question to answer. And you get it a lot. Like, what value did this produce? Well, there's really, a few ways you can solve it. It really is going to depend upon the specific, solution that you're putting into place. But we did this and I was actually fortunate at Humana because they had a ton of experience with kind of randomized control trials and things like that. But we would actually, for every model that went into production where it was possible to do so, we would deploy a randomized control trial. We would take some random sample of, whatever it was, we were trying to change, whether that's, people or processes or whatever. We would randomly assign some of them to the model, randomly assign some of them to the original process that we're hoping to replace or augment, and then we would compare the results. And then you just multiply that out across, some point in time, and that tells you the actual value that you were able to achieve. And so doing that, we were able to prove, like, as pretty definitively as you can possibly prove a thing from, a scientific perspective, that our models were able to generate, millions of dollars. And right. So, that's the most mature way to do it. But you have to be really careful, right? Because you have to be thinking about this stuff from the very beginning, right? From the very beginning, before you ever put, I say pen to paper, but before you ever write a line of code, you should be understanding exactly where in the business process your solution is going to fit in, exactly what kinds of, outputs from your model that you need to, create or, produce in order to augment or help to optimize those decisions. And then you also need to be thinking about, how am I going to get that feedback loop? How do I get that return and understand, like, what's actually happening? Like, who actually responded, or did they actually use the tool, or things like that? And then understand beforehand, what is your measurement strategy going to be at the end? Like, how are you going to prove this to me that you have value? Because it's going to come. Look, like, maybe some of you are really earlier in your AI journey, you have executive buy-in, and they're going to be, they're going to be excited, right? But the day will come when they start to ask the question, we've invested, X millions of dollars into your group. Where's the value? How much value did you produce? What did you do to, increase the value of our company? And you need to be ready to answer that question.
Absolutely. Every function in the business has to answer that question at some point. I don't care what your
Exactly.
role is. And if you can answer it well, that is the difference between getting promoted and getting laid off.
That's exactly right. And, for some teams, it's easier, like IT teams, we're managing the infrastructure of your entire company. It's kind of easy to say, like, that's valuable, right? But, data scientists, we straddle, a line between technology and business operations. We have to kind of sit halfway in both worlds. And so, not only, can we get away a little bit with, like, oh yeah, kind of the very exciting, it's AI, very cool. But at the same time, like, you have to be thinking about it from a business perspective, because ultimately that's what your solutions are meant to drive.
Yep, definitely. Okay, that explains the how over there at Carrier. I got to ask about the what. I need to know what you're building over there.
Yeah, so we're building all kinds of stuff, right? So, man, it's like really hard to even decide where to start. But we typically differentiate it into two buckets. And I have to first, preface this with saying we are not the only teams at Carrier doing AI. So I don't want to do any disservices or anything to some of the other teams that are doing some really great work here. But we kind of focus on two different areas, which is our product teams and then our enterprise kind of business and operations types of teams. So, obviously one big area where we're focusing is generative AI, right? There's been a ton of excitement around generative AI. The technology has, had leaps and bounds improvements in a very short amount of time. Very shocking, honestly, the extent to which it matured with almost zero warning. And then, of course, like the hype that comes up with that, right? And the potential and the ideas that are, percolating very quickly as a result of, this transformation in this technology, has produced a lot of excitement. So, we're obviously making a large push into this, but where I think that we're maybe thinking of it a little bit differently than a lot of companies are, and where, I personally have been kind of pushing us to go, is that a lot of the solutions, I think, and this is very true for just like it was true for classical AI, where I was talking about, you're using it in kind of very specific ways to enhance specific operations and specific business capabilities, is the same thing can be true for generative AI. I know when we think of generative AI, we think of ChatGPT, we think of like going to the website and, give me an itinerary for my vacation, or, maybe even write me some code. And that's great. And it's incredibly powerful. But when you think about it from a business user perspective, like what does that do for them, right? And in many ways, I think, except with the exception of some power users, not always much, right? I mean, it's amazing and it's incredible, but it's not necessarily geared towards solving a particular or specific problem. So what we want to do when we think about generative AI applications is we're thinking about what are the specific types of problems that we can solve with generative AI. So one specific type of problem that we can easily solve with AI is with generative AI in particular is, accessibility to knowledge, right? So, that's kind of an easy one. It actually is a chat-based application, but we have tons of information out there. We have tons of documentation, whether that's on HR documentation, IT documentation, or whether it's even as something as complicated from an engineering perspective, like our technical documentation around our products and, kind of the maintenance and everything around those products. So how can we take this, massive amount of information that is very difficult to kind of sift through and make it more accessible to our employees, right? And again, this is getting to like a specific thing and a specific need that they have. And so, we're doing a big push into, knowledge bases and things like that, like vector databases and, doing the search on that and trying to optimize and understand the best way to get that done. Another way in which we're doing this is through actual batch processes. So, this is where I think a lot of people are missing on some of the benefit, which is that people are just constantly thinking of generative AI as chat, but you can do things in batch, right? You can take away some of the complexity and abstract away some of the complexity for the end users. So one of the things that we found through experimentation with generative AI models is they're very sensitive to your prompting, right? I mean, there's a reason that prompt engineering is becoming such an important skill to have. And so if your users aren't well-versed in the proper way to engineer their prompts or don't understand the level of experimentation that might need to go into prompting in order to get good outputs from your model, then you are kind of setting yourself up for potential failure. But if my team, who does have the expertise, can create kind of batch processes around specific needs of the business where we've already done that experimentation and we understand like precisely what kind of prompt engineering or what modeling architecture or what foundation model is the best for this particular use case and getting, optimal answers for that use case, then we can take all that complexity away from the end user. So an example of this that I think a lot of companies are even pursuing is, like summarization, right? So call centers. We get a lot of calls into our call centers. We want to be able to take in those audio files. We want to be able to extract insights from them. In the past, extracting insights from them were either, it was clunky because you have to have a person to go through and listen to the calls, or we were using outdated NLP techniques to kind of look at, what words are being used the most. And we all know that you don't really get necessarily great insights from that. But with generative AI, with its ability, and I say this, kind of with air quotes here for those, you can't see me, but in air quotes, is that it kind of understands context, right? And it's able to better understand what it is that you're trying to pull out of it. So we can get greater insights, and we can also produce summaries of the calls that then takes the lift away from the call center representative to have to go through the long process of notating the call and summarizing what happened, right? So this is something that the end user never even has to touch. We handle it all in the background. Another one that got talked about, which Lexi over here worked on, was actually mentioned by the CEO of AWS during his keynote speech at reInvent, was using generative AI for OCR. This is another batch application of generative AI, where a lot of the complications and the challenges with using traditional OCR techniques is that you have to be very explicit about the information that you're trying to extract off of your documents. So like location on the document where the information is, the exact wording of what you're trying to extract. I mean, it's very sensitive to those types of changes. So that's a challenge. So one of the use cases we have is we want to be able to allow customers to upload their utility bills so that we can then help them with creating better efficiencies around their energy consumption. But if you've ever seen utility bills from different companies, they're all over the place, right? And they even use different words. They might say like total usage or total consumption. Those two things mean the same thing. And the numbers that they're reporting are represented on the same scale, but they're completely different words in completely different formats. But generative AI understands that usage and consumption in this context means the exact same thing. So if we can use generative AI to kind of abstract away some of the complexity of OCR, where we have to do minimal coding in order to extract that information, then that's incredibly powerful, right? That means OCR requires so much less work to make an effective solution for you, right? And there's a million use cases like this. So I always talk about like classical AI as having, core foundations that everyone knows, right? You have like supervised learning, unsupervised learning, anomaly detection, forecasting, optimization, all these different types of foundational capabilities that you can employ with classical AI models. But we should be thinking the same way about generative AI. With generative AI, it's things like chat, it's content generation, it's summarization, it's document analysis and Q&A, it's coding and research and analytics. And then eventually, of course, as I mentioned in my talk at AWS, like the holy grail would be the future of AI agents, right? That's what we need to be thinking about with AI from a generative perspective and where we're heading in the future. And of course, we're doing a ton with, traditional AI methods as well, with a lot of focus on, forecasting for, sales and supply chain and demand forecasting, things along those lines. We're doing a lot of things when it comes to, operational improvements and productivity improvements with traditional AI in terms of prioritizing workloads, based on what outcome it is that we're trying to achieve, things along those lines. I can talk more about it, but I feel like I've gone on a long time.
It sounds like you have a lot on your plate here, lots of different applications. And I want to ask you, Seth, just because it sounds like you have such a finger on the pulse of every, what's kind of possible currently, and thinking beyond chatbots, for example, with generative. I would love to know what you're excited about if you were to take off your head of AI for carrier hat off for a minute and just imagine the 14-year-old boy inside of you who is just excitedly reading research papers and like, oh, wow, this thing is kind of cool. Like what in the space right now just gets you excited, even if it has nothing to do with HVAC or, applications at carrier?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think for me, it's more about how these tools start to become better at anticipating people's needs and starting to make decisioning on our behalf. Because if you've had any experience with like Microsoft Copilot and stuff, it's like amazing, right? It's really cool. It can do really cool stuff. I love the ability, like in Teams, to be able to just have it recap a meeting for me, right? You know how many times I'm late to meetings these days, and it just will tell me right there and then like a recap of everything that's happened up to that point. That's amazing. But what it can't do, right, is like use my calendar, right? It can't schedule meetings for me. Like I'm excited for it to get to that type of level. And I know maybe that sounds like not what the 14-year-old Seth would have wanted, but you can take that, and kind of extend it to anything, right? Actually, if I'm being honest with you, I'm a huge video game nerd, right? I love playing video games. Talk about 14-year-old Seth, the thing that I'm most excited about is the potential to have like characters inside video games that will actually respond realistically to you. And so you get away from the world of canned responses and make it more dynamic, like your interactions with those characters. So I imagine like there was this research paper that came out recently that was using GPT in order to kind of create a simulated world. And basically you had like these different avatars, right? And they put them in a little town. There was like a little town that they created with a video game type of environment. And each of these characters was controlled by a different instance of ChatGPT, and it was able to like move around the environment and everything and interact with the other characters. And they had some form of abstracted memory and things like that. But all that to say is that they actually like acted like people, right? I mean, they woke up in the morning and they drank their coffee, and then they would go to the coffee shop or to work, and they would work and they would interact with people. They even organized a party at one point. I mean, like imagine that in like a video game world, right? Like if you could have a world that was like so dynamic, like in an open world setting where, you're talking to characters, and then based on that interaction, they make independent decisions about things, right? And then those independent decisions can have ripple effects. Now, I can imagine the complexity that would lead to, right? How do you create a narrative around something that you can't control, right? It'd be difficult to build those guardrails. And plus, there's all kinds of implications from a compute and everything perspective, right? And making that efficient. But, so that's what 14-year-old Seth would be excited about, probably even younger. But I mean, again, you take that and you apply it to any kind of technology we have today. I mean, if you can imagine like how, Siri's great, these types of applications are amazing. Take it to the next level with generative AI, where it's able to better understand your desires or your needs, and then couple that with ability to accurately take action, like on the device or whatever it is or whatever it's controlling, and be able to help to kind of just optimize our day-to-day environment and kind of take away some of the mundane aspects of our lives, right? That's the kind of stuff that gets me excited.
Do you remember what the title of that paper was? I'd love to put it in the show notes.
Oh my gosh, I don't remember it offhand, but I will send it to you after this. It was a really cool paper. You can find it on Archive.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I definitely want to read it. It's just, a chat GPT ant farm, basically.
It was incredible.
Right now, they're organizing parties. When they start organizing political parties, it may be time to intervene. But until then, it's just a fun thought experiment. Seth, man, this has been packed with information. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing all of your experience. And I think this is going to be fantastically helpful for the folks out there who want to make sure that their work is being seen and heard and utilized in a meaningful way. So thank you for doing this and being on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rob, for having me. This is really great. This is a very unique experience. I love listening to podcasts, so it's kind of cool to, actually be on one. So I'll definitely be sharing this with my kids.
How AI Happens is brought to you by Sama. Sama provides accurate data for ambitious AI. Specializing in image, video, and sensor data annotation and validation for machine learning algorithms in industries such as transportation, retail, e-commerce, media, medtech, robotics, and agriculture. For more information, head to sama.com.